Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to be co-hosting our third annual Business Sustainability and Technology Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about all of our panelists that we have here today. My name is Anna Siefken. I'm the Executive Director for the Wilton E. Institute for Energy Innovation. And we love hosting this event in partnership with the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. So many of us we're all over the country today and are very excited to have this conversation with you. Carnegie Mellon serves as a destination for a lot of knowledge around energy, sustainability, technology, all of the topics for today. So very excited to get started. And with that, I am going to pass over to our moderator for today, one of our MBA students in the Tepper School of Business, Eric Stieb.
Thank you very much, Anna. Really glad to have everyone here. Thank you for all the attendees, and thank you to all the panelists who've been able to join us virtually today. Just like to briefly introduce our panelists, then we'll kick into our first few sets of questions. First off, we have Commissioner Andrew Flynn, who's Commissioner of Mount Lebanon Municipality here in Pennsylvania. Then we have Dr. Zosia Brown, who's the Vice President of Sustainability for Nexii Building Solutions in Canada. Then we have Cliff Majersik, who's the Senior Advisor for Policy and Programs at the Institute of Market Transformation. We also have Professor Jeff Wurgler, who is the Nomura Professor of Finance at New York University Stern School of Business. And lastly, we also have Mark Chambers, who is the Senior Director for Building Emissions and Community Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality in the Executive Office of the President. Thank you very much, panelists, again for joining us. Let's begin by having our panelists discuss their professional roles and how that role pertains to the notion of sustainability. Could each of you begin by providing your working definition of sustainability and how you're able to measure it in your professional area? We're going to start with Professor Wurgler, then go to Dr. Brown, then Mark, and then Commissioner Flynn, and finally have Cliff finish this one off. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. So I come at these issues from an academic perspective, so I'm really interested to hear the government and industry panelists' perspective as well. And I've come to this area only in the past few years based on personal interest, and which I've turned into a small research agenda. With respect to definition of sustainability, so I can't say I have an all-encompassing definition, and I'd like to hear what the other panelists say about this, but I sort of think about it as like the concept of like freedom. You know, it's kind of domain specific. We have freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech. There are limits on these freedoms. You know, we don't have a freedom to slander, we don't have a freedom to libel, and so on. In the same way, I feel like sustainability is also usefully thought of as very kind of domain specific. You know, we would like sustainability with respect to, say, gender equity or, you know, pollution, you know, air quality, water resources, certainly with respect to climate change. So, I feel like, so in the same way we have limits on freedom of religion and freedom of speech, we need kind of there are trade-offs involved in our definitions of sustainability. We want to make sure that people can eat, you know, there's a degree of economic growth, there's a degree of technological progress, and so on. So how to work those into the definition of sustainability, you know, in sort of practical, operational way. I'm really interested to hear what other people feel about that.
Okay, I can jump in next. I'm Zosia Brown. I'm Vice President of Sustainability at Nexii, and thank you to Nick and Anna and the Tepper School of Business team for inviting Nexii to be a part of this forum. Nexii is a green building company that designs and manufactures high performance buildings and green building products that reduce carbon emissions, have up to 75% faster build times, and near zero waste. So my role on this panel is to represent manufacturing and product innovation, specifically the building and construction sector. Sustainability is a really core part of our mission at Nexii, which is to build a vibrant future for people and the planet. And I think my preferred definition, just for its simplicity, of sustainability comes from the EU Environmental Action Programme, and it's 5 words. It's living well within environmental limits. What I like about this definition is it touches on social and economic aspects of sustainability when we talk about living well or quality of life. And it also recognizes that our planetary resources are finite. At Nexii, we're really putting into practice this kind of triple bottom line approach to sustainability. So environment, social, and economic. And when we talk about environmental, we want to maintain integrity. We want systems that are in balance. We want to consume our natural resources at a rate that can be replenished, right, for a livable environment. On the social side, it's about human rights and needs that are attainable by all. We want families to have enough resources to remain safe and secure. And so for us as a company, it's making sure that our product and our buildings are accessible to all, especially communities at risk. And then economic prosperity, we want communities to be able to maintain independence. We want folks to secure livelihoods, even in a rapidly changing climate. And so that for us at Nexii is about driving low carbon growth and creating clean tech jobs. In terms of how we measure sustainability, we have spent some time defining 8 long-term impacts that we're driving towards across environmental, social, economic. And all of our business functions are aligned towards these 8 impacts. And we have goals that are underpinning each one of these, and we're committed to reporting our progress annually and transparently. So I think just broadly, we're also just thinking about, not doing less bad, not reducing our impact, but really thinking about being a force of good. This idea about net positive and the concept of, is the world a better place because our company is in it?
I think that was my cue, or was it going to Andrew?
It was going to you, Mark. Yep.
Great, thanks, and I appreciate everyone for having me here and being able to kind of join this conversation. I'm an alumni of Carnegie Mellon University, first as a graduate of the School of Architecture, College of Fine Arts, and the School of Public Policy and Management, Heinz College. And I'll just be completely honest with everyone. Like I'm less concerned with how we define sustainability because there needs to be on-ramps and access for everyone in every job to be able to, in every sector really, to be able to define this for themselves and to, it's almost like the most important thing is that you are defining it. I think that there's no room on the sidelines for this work right now, and especially in this incredibly impactful decade. And so being able to bring your capacity and your skill sets, as opposed to believing this is something for someone else to sort out, I think is the real critical path here. And it's the most important to make sure that we are understanding that no industry and no sector is spared from having a really critical definition on how sustainability is incorporated into their work and their skill sets. My role now is constantly evolving. In January of this year, I was appointed by the Biden administration as a senior director for building emissions and community resilience. And it's the first time this role has existed in the White House. And it's an honor to serve President Biden and to use all of the levers really of the whole of government approach and the climate team, particularly on my end, to help to decarbonize the built environment and the communities that we spend most of our lives in. And I think that it's also critical for us to be thinking about the fact that we have an opportunity here to be able to look at how the work we're doing right now, the transition to a clean energy economy, the work that you're seeing play out in Congress today even, it is particularly potent right now, and it's particularly important for all of us to be looking at how those definitions are changing the way we're doing our work. Prior to taking this role on, I also had the unique distinction of having served as Director of Sustainability for 2 great American cities. Most recently, as Director of Sustainability for New York City under Mayor de Blasio, and then prior to that, as Director of Sustainability and Energy for Washington, D.C. And so I think that what I'm trying to kind of set the stage for, and particularly part of this conversation, is that no matter kind of where you're coming to this work, whether it is in kind of local government, state government, or in private sector, there's an opportunity to be able to make sure that you are bending your skill sets, your passions, and your work products towards the ends that are supporting our kind of longevity and the ability to thrive, and as well as to do that in a way that kind of recognizes that we have a really critical decade in front of us to be able to rapidly reduce emissions in a way that kind of meets the moment, not just as a species, but also as individuals that are part of that great this great work to transition to a zero emissions economy. So happy to be here and happy to kind of keep this conversation here from all the other panelists.
Thank you, Mark. Commissioner Flynn.
All right, yeah, and I also want to repeat thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is really, it's an important topic, and it's one that I've been working on in a variety of ways for most of my career. Professionally, I'm a municipal advisor, so I work with state and local governments all over the country. Have also worked with the various types of agencies around the globe on long-term financial planning, tax policy, and infrastructure investment. In my evening job, I'm a locally elected official here in the South Hills of Pennsylvania for a municipality of about 35,000 people. So I see this from a variety of different angles, having worked with large agencies and small agencies alike. And I think Mark is right. I mean, there needs to be a lot of on-ramps in this topic. There are a lot of different approaches and a lot of different angles that we need to be thinking about this. And one of the reasons why I enjoy working with local government, especially, is because local government does so many different things depending on where you are and how you perceive local government. And so there's lots of opportunity for innovation at the local government level. But it takes proactive engagement and very thoughtful people participating. Now, for me, thinking about what is environmental sustainability, or what is sustainability more broadly, I'm always thinking about environmental sustainability, but practically speaking, I do think about it more broadly. How do we ensure that communities have the ability to maintain and improve themselves over time? And it's not just a question of environmental quality, but it's more broad. It's as the population and the economy and the environment change, how are communities of people able to work together to improve their lives, the lives of their neighbors, their families, to move forward? There's lots of pieces to that, and adding the environmental layer is one additional layer on a spider web of a lot of complexity that already exists that people are already trying to solve for. It's an important additional layer, but it is additional. It's not unique, and I think we need to recognize that as this being a layer that needs to be integrated into our long-term thinking, rather than being separate and apart from the core functions of our communities and how they work together.
Thank you. Cliff?
Hi, my name is Cliff Majerzik. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this illustrious panel. I am a senior advisor at the Institute for Market Transformation, and we are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we bridge the intersection among communities, especially disinvested communities, the communities that are most affected by climate change, governments, and businesses. And we look to find ways to spotlight business practices and advance policies that will help our buildings to improve, to benefit everyone, regardless of where they live, work, or play, and to fight climate change. And so I would echo what we heard from Zosia. Sustainability, the thinking of the root of the word, it's what is sustainable? How can we live well within our environment, within the environmental limitations that the earth has? And echo what Mark said, that we really need to think about this as centering equity, that those who have contributed least to climate change are suffering most from it. And we really need to make sure that everyone, regardless where they live, work, or play, regardless of the color of their skin or anything else, that they are protected and that they can thrive in this environment. So our work is mostly directly with businesses, helping business owners and building owners and service providers that help them improve the performance of their buildings, so that their buildings will be more climate friendly and healthier and better places to live and work and more profitable. But also we do a lot of work with governments, federal, state, and especially local. We work with more than 50 local governments around the country and have helped many of them adopt policies to create a market feedback loop that will drive building owners to want to invest in their buildings to make them more valuable and profitable buildings and more climate friendly buildings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all very much for those definitions. Just a note to the audience, please enter any questions that you may have into the panel's Q&A function. That way, when we have some time at the end, we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. Moving on to our next question. So stepping back, each of you represent different sectors in the economy. People here from government, nonprofits, manufacturing, finance, and academia. How do you view the role of your sector in the economy with respect to sustainability and what your sector can contribute there? We're going to move in the opposite direction as the last question. So Cliff, you could start us off, please, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Well, I'm in the nonprofit sector, and so we have as our mission to help people and fight climate change, and so. Unlike a business, which also has to report to its shareholders, or a government, which has to be responsive to its constituents, we have that mission, and that overlaps. In order to achieve that mission, it's going to need to be profitable for companies to make the investments that are needed to transition to a carbon neutral economy. And we always need to be mindful of the impact on everybody, and especially those who've traditionally not had a voice in policymaking. So, I would think that for every sector, whether it's nonprofits or business or government, there just needs to be a real sense of urgency. The climate crisis is upon us, as we've heard from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's not something in the future, it's something that's happening already. People's homes are burning, the wildfires are fouling our air with smoke, hurricanes are drenching us. In New York City, under Ida, more than 24 people died in basements, mostly illegal basement apartments, from flooding. And that flooding was a consequence of climate change. So we just need to take on real urgency around climate change, but also around the persistent injustices that have attended to many of our communities. And they rightfully should not wait longer for justice. So there needs to be an urgency of working together and recognizing that there are opportunities, win-win opportunities, where businesses can profit from investing in investments that will provide living wages, high-road jobs, and fight climate change. And so this is a real time of urgency, and I hope that all of us can come together with a sense of purpose.
Thank you. Commissioner Flynn?
I appreciate the importance of the nonprofit community in this space. Again, local government, is there are 90,000 subnational government agencies in the United States. There's lots of us, and it's largely driven by citizen activists who are participating in local government. And it's difficult to get a lot of expertise at the table a lot of the time at the smaller governments. So nonprofits, academia are really important to help kind of build the bridge and the understanding for local government action in many respects. Larger local governments are less that case. But there is lots of really interesting opportunities for local government. And if you think about the role that local government plays, whether it's on private property policy, it's zoning and land use, it's building codes, it's setbacks, it's property transfer requirements, it's taxing structures to incentivize activities. There's lots that local government can do from a private property perspective to help this transformation. But then there's also the public property side of this. How do we prioritize the capital improvement programs of local governments? How do we think about the utilization of our public rights of way? 80% of local government property is typically dedicated to motorized traffic. And so much of our carbon emissions are based upon motorized vehicle travel. It's at the local level where you're going to start making shifts in terms of how people move in their community. We all know that a lot of that transportation is that 1 mile activity. The way communities are designed is a local issue, and it takes time to make those transitions. So there's lots of interesting, innovative opportunities to think about how does the local government take action. But again, I go back to there's lots of us, and so the change is incremental. Yeah, but then, and that's on a property level, but then you also talk about public services, right? Whether we're talking about public transportation, we're talking about utility management, we're talking about, things like, how do we manage our waste stream, right? Again, we don't necessarily think of that as a public thing, but again, that the material stream is something that goes through every local government. And how we understand the material stream is something that can be innovated at the local level. To create more efficiency in how we think about what our material stream is and what the downstream utilizations of creating a circular economy are. And then you think about things on the private sector, right? Yeah, local government, again, is not necessarily the most high-powered thing, right? You typically are thinking about federal or state government, but climate action is a function of network leadership. We all have to take shared action. This isn't a hierarchical activity. So at a local level, local government has an important role to build the network, to point the direction, to foster change. So it's not just about forcing change, it's about creating the environment in which change can occur, bringing nonprofits to the table, bringing the private sector to the table, bringing residents to the table to say, hey, let's go on this journey together. Lots of really interesting things at the local level, but we always appreciate all the support we can get from federal and state agencies to support the journey.
Thank you very much.
Excellent handoff. And I think that the role of government, whether it's local government, state government, federal government, it has several things that it does very, very well. And like with all other sectors of the economy, several things not so well, right? And but ultimately, I think that we have to kind of pull out themes around the pieces that really are strong and how we can actually look at the advantages that come along with these opportunities. And so I think two themes that come to mind, at least that are worth emphasizing, especially alongside, again, these incredible historic investments in jobs and infrastructure and that are taking place in Congress right now, and with the kind of work on the Build Back Better framework. And those two themes I'm thinking of are kind of the ability to unlock and the ability to accelerate. And so I think that the ability to unlock the inertia around complicated climate work, and I work a lot in buildings, which buildings can be incredibly complicated, but the solutions for a lot of those have been around for quite some time. So it's a matter of how do you kind of streamline what into a built environment in a way that is not as disruptive. And so I think that thinking about how to unlock the inertia around some of those complicated projects and work, or the technological progress of solutions to those complicated problems, those are the pieces that, with resources and the wider reach, the government can be very good at its best. And it's good at it through the ability to create conditions that unlock progress, right? So that takes the form of investments in resources, in research and development and analysis and metrics that allow for scaling. And it's really so that businesses don't have to always spend all that money on R&D, and they can kind of utilize the kind of trusted framework and of the national laboratories and kind of the larger efforts that take into significant kind of data points into how we're able to not only centralize, but also kind of create a baseline that is really useful for lots of business development and growth. And it also takes the form of, national codes and standards, appliance standards, building codes, energy codes, all those pieces that, again, are this kind of trusted resource that local governments, state governments can build upon and create environments for innovation. And that's what kind of leads to a lot of the pieces that we want to see happen also in manufacturing. And then thinking about accelerating, I think, is also important, especially when you have these larger governing principles like our kind of response to a changing climate. And those have the ability to kind of scale things once they've already started, kicked off. What's today? Friday. So on Wednesday, I think many of you probably saw the president driving an electric Hummer around in Detroit. I think that being able to know that the zero emission vehicle future is right now and is happening, that's part of how you kind of invest in ways that scale things once they've already started and the technology is here and the momentum is here. And the government could be very good at being able to unlock those resources, like with hundreds and thousands of hundreds of thousands of charging stations and infrastructure that will support the transition to zero emission vehicles. And it also allows for those things to be lasting. I think that's also an important part of this. It's like, so that it's happening everywhere at the same time, that everyone's able to benefit from the important work of that acceleration in a way that doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities, which I think is also a really important theme. And maybe that's another theme to add to this. It's just the theme of kind of justice and empathy and the vision for an inclusive future. That is also important, kind of set those guardrails when you're setting targets. One of the pieces we are working on very intently and are very proud of is the work around environmental and social justice. And it's incredibly centered and important to how we're tackling the climate crisis. For the first time in our history, through what was called the Justice 40 initiative, the president has directed the federal government to work to ensure that 40% of the climate and clean energy investments and benefits that will be flowing to disadvantaged and overburdened communities all throughout the country. And it's across the full reach of the federal government and programs. And so it's not just, in my sector about buildings, but all of them. And that's incredibly, incredibly potent. And it sets a very clear agenda and a priority that social and environmental justice is part of how we get there, as opposed to it being an add-on. So I do think that acknowledging where you're good and what things you can add to this particular effort in a way that is transformative is incredibly important. And I think that there's enough seat to the table for it not just to be government-led, but also private sector-led, as well as nonprofits and all the other components of our economy.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Brown?
Okay, I'll jump in there and say, I really appreciate what you mentioned, Mark, about governments creating the conditions to unlock progress. I think that's so important that government regulation really sets the rules. Like, for example, without the BC Step Code here in Canada, we wouldn't be building passive house towers. That policy and regulation is the only way really to induce that widespread change meaningfully. There's no shortage of innovation. And there's no questions that businesses can transition to net zero carbon solutions. In fact, we're there already. And thanks to the innovation and hard work of the architecture and design community, we know that we can build net zero carbon buildings anywhere in the world. And that's important because our sector, like the building and construction sector, represents 39% of global energy-related carbon emissions. It's huge. Much of that is down to how we heat and cool our buildings, the construction-related emissions and waste from demolition, and also emissions tied up in the materials we select, embodied carbon of our buildings. And we know that the volume of buildings is going to double in footprint to 2060. And then the other important factor, kind of from a manufacturing industry perspective, is that buildings and construction in our sector is considered a market pull for heavy industry materials such as cement and steel. We consume up to 90% of concrete globally and 50% of steel. And yes, there's a lot of pressure for those industries to innovate themselves and clean up their act, but it's also up to us as a building industry to create designs and structures that favor lower carbon materials. So in terms of Nexii and how we're embracing that challenge, we use innovative materials. What we refer to as Nexii. It's a green alternative to concrete, behaves very similar to concrete, but we use no Portland cement, which means that we can reduce carbon emissions in the material itself, as well as create really high performance, highly insulated building panels that help our clients reduce carbon emissions year on year in the operation phase of buildings. And we also understand that kind of designing durable and resilient products that can extend the life and the reuse of buildings is a really key part of driving decarbonization along the building value chain. That's kind of thinking about holistically about the whole life of the building is something that we're very much focused on and trying to play a significant role there in driving the industry forward.
Thank you very much. Professor Wurgler, do you mind wrapping us up in this one?
Sure, thank you. So the role of the education sector, how I think about that is, well, from my own perspective, at the end of each year, I submit a report, what I did on my summer vacation last year, and that has sort of three components: research, teaching, and service. So we can think about each of these dimensions and how it pertains to the sustainability. So certainly from a research perspective, and I'm coming at this from a very finance-oriented department and background, there's any number of areas that we could be studying in greater depth. The pricing and trading of emissions rights, ESG metrics, the role of businesses, financial institutions, good and bad, on sustainability. I think professors and researchers have more than the usual degree of flexibility because we don't have sort of business pressures constraining us toward one measure or one sort of message or another. We can sort of spotlight bad practices in a way that private sector actors and sometimes government cannot. So I'm just pleased to see that climate finance is no longer a niche area in my department, and it's much more mainstream. With respect to another dimension, teaching, teaching about sustainability begins with young children. Of course, I see this at my kids' school, and I'm happy to see their focus on that. When I grew up, climate change was barely discussed, or if it was framed carefully as a kind of contentious scientific theory. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, maybe it doesn't even matter. Maybe if you're in Canada, you appreciate the warmer weather, so it could be good or bad. Who knows? But we're past that now, and I think even for my kids, I don't worry about creating a climate anxiety in them so much, as long as we keep that to a manageable level. I think a degree of anxiety is called for. And if it makes them more productive and responsible citizens, then it's just kind of, that's an acceptable trade-off for me as a parent. With respect to university level teaching, it's kind of a fact of university life that teachers are older than their students, yet it's the students themselves who are disproportionately affected and interested in climate change issues. So there's a degree of kind of catching up and seeing things from the students' perspectives that isn't present in many areas of the academy, but we need to do our best and keep up in the finance department and across the business school, and bring the issues into the core curriculum as much as possible. And with respect to service, Professor Muller is doing a great service in hosting events like these, bringing people together from different areas that might not otherwise work together. I, in my own kind of service category, I've been organizing some special issues in finance journals. And what that means is we just select papers from a particular area, and these papers tend to be more impactful when they're not, when they're rolled together and say, here, the November 2021 issue of the Journal of Financial Economics has all of these papers in this particular area. And those, those can be referred to more easily and more impactfully.
Thank you very much, especially like that comment about changing the curriculum at business schools to sort of reflect major issues that a lot of us will be dealing with in our careers as we leave. So really appreciate that perspective. Taking a step over to the technology side we're talking about today, just for all the panelists, I have a three-part question on that. What is your view of the role that technology can or should play in promoting sustainability? And then what are some obstacles to the development and adoption of that technology? And then what actions can either the private or public sectors take to promote the innovation and adoption of those technologies? And we'll start in our original order, just go with Professor Wurgler for this one.
Okay, thank you. So certainly a fundamental economic issue about the role of technology and the obstacles to adopting relevant technologies is the concept of network externalities. And so you're nodding, Eric. I see that you have sort of a grasp on the concept, but so think of something like electric cars. It's very important to have charging stations all over the place. And you can't have those all over the place with just Tesla on the road. So how to create those externalities, or for the most efficient path from point A to point B, or the safest path from point A to point B in a car in the future is going to involve cars talking to each other and say, hey, how's the traffic down there? You just came from there. Let me know. Is there a way I should go around it and save some energy, save some gas, whatever. But there are these proprietary technologies that maybe Tesla doesn't want to share with the next EV maker. And maybe that interferes with the communication possibilities. So we have network externalities. We have these, market incentives to protect proprietary technology. And in each case, there's certainly a role for government to provide funds or incentives to relax, that constraint on intellectual property, or take the lead in building charging stations and whatnot. I guess
thank you very
maybe
much.
I'll add a little bit more,
Yep.
just with respect to your, the last component of your question. An important focus for policymakers is just to maintain consistent policy and reduce policy uncertainty, because for some companies, they might just say, I just hope I make it till the next administration and everything's going to be rolled back. And why invest now if that's going to happen? So a degree of constancy of policy, certainly Mark could speak to this from a government perspective. Businesses care a lot about that. Let's not overcommit if that's going to be a source of uncertainty down the road.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Brown, do you have anything to add?
I do. So I think technology is incredibly important for the building and construction sector, in particular, where other industries have increased productivity, automation, prefabrication, and that sort of thing. Our sector has been very slow to adapt. We're still building buildings the way we did 30, 40 years ago. And part of that is because of factors like lack of integration between trades. It's because most buildings and teams are one-off, so it's hard to scale solutions. It's because project delivery factors and timeframes mean that it's more favorable to use established products and specifications. So there's little room to innovate there at the design stage. And then I think really important is lack of accountability for performance. Unlike the automotive sector, for example, there is very little accountability for the performance of buildings, or there has been until recently. We're starting to see a shift there, which is great in terms of stretch codes and performance-based codes for buildings. But in particular at Nexii, when we talk about technology, we talk about three things. One is innovative low carbon materials. So we use less carbon intensive materials overall, which makes our building envelope panels lighter weight and reduces emissions in manufacturing and transportation. We talk about technology in our manufacturing process. We're using precision manufacturing in a controlled and efficient environment. We use 3D software to map Nexii panels to project specifications, and we can produce those panels so in a way that they're rapidly assembled on site with very tight tolerances and near zero waste. So that designing for rapid assembly, but also the ability to disassemble buildings at the end of life and repurpose panels for next life, essentially. And then the third thing we think about is smart buildings, and that really tracking the performance of our products and our buildings all the way through to use and next life, as I mentioned. So some obstacles that we have encountered is that because, well, new innovative materials do have approval barriers, and that can slow the approval process for projects for us. The other thing is that relationships in the construction sector tend to be very local. And so if we want to be showing up in the marketplaces that we're targeting, it's building those relationships, and that takes time. And the third thing is that there are capital barriers. Because we're a manufacturing oriented company, there are capital barriers around getting close to those target markets. So we do have a business model that we've developed to expand and grow, and that allows us to bring our manufacturing closer to the customer, and that's we call our Nexii Certified Manufacturing Program. And actually here in Pittsburgh, we've got an active partnership and discussions with RIDC, with PJ Dick, with Trinity Commercial Development and Craig Rapoli. Michael Keaton is an investor in a potential Pittsburgh plant that we're targeting, working really hard to hopefully make this work at Hazelwood Green Mill 19. So a lot of potential in the region. That's now kind of a real innovative hub around green innovation. And we're hoping to be able to help build on that momentum and bring clean jobs to the region as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mark, if you could talk about this, and if you wouldn't mind touching on some of the regulatory certainty piece that Professor Wurgler brought up as well. I know that there's just a major bill passed through the House this morning, and I know there's a kind of constant ping-ponging as control changes in Washington.
No, sure, and I think that there's there's always this notion that we can wait for better conditions, and I think that what's very different right now is that we are clearly seeing that the next decade, there's indications that if we don't kind of face and deal with our constraints, that those will continue to lead to lethal consequences. We have interagency working groups on wildfire, extreme heat, flooding, coastal storms, drought. Like all of these are particularly pertinent issues to not just regions all across the country, but the businesses within those regions. And so I think that if the kind of extreme circumstances we are experiencing in rapid succession are not enough motivation, I'm not sure what is. I mean, I think that we also have to acknowledge that I believe that technology, like creativity, thrives in conditions of constraint. And so I think that we have an opportunity to continue to kind of push forward in a way in which we're setting these kind of national, we have this thing called the nationally determined contribution, which is the overarching goals for reduction of emissions over the next decade. And so we set this 50 to 52% NDC, and that kind of creates these guardrails, these constraints that now we're going to be following up with all of these historic investments that are happening throughout Congress right now. And so it's a matter of kind of, again, putting those guardrails, those boundaries in place, and then providing and creating as much opportunity for the innovation, the job growth, and the kind of creative response that will be necessary in order to be able to meet that moment. And one of the things about technology that I think is particularly important is that not every technology has to be new technology, right? Part of this is also making sure that existing technology is thriving and starting to kind of move into the places where we're not able to kind of like take those externalities and push them off somewhere, which is something that happens with emissions often. One of the kind of real pieces that we've been focused a lot of our attention on is around heat pumps. Now, for a crowd that might not be kind of focused in the building sector, like Zosia and myself, but there is heat pumps are an incredible appliance and piece of kind of building equipment that will allow for us to rapidly decarbonize our built environment. It allows us to move towards electrification in our buildings, and allows for us to do that in a way that's going to take advantage of the clean electricity grid that is also underway with all of these historic investments. So it's and I'm not going to kind of dive too deep into what heat pumps are, but it's some people refer to them as refrigerators in reverse, but long story short is that something that provides heating and cooling in a way that is dramatically more efficient than our typical technology and what we typically run out to the hardware store to replace when our air conditioning goes out. So we're in a place where we have these existing technologies that are utilized across the globe too. There's 20 million heat pumps that are made globally, and it's a $50-60 billion industry. And so I don't think that this is something that is just a newcomer to the market. But the question is, are the conditions being created that allow for us to be able to confront the environments that we're facing in a way that utilizes technology and then invest in them to make them better, and make sure that we're recognizing that through our Department of Energy, we've even started an initiative called the E3 initiative, where we put $10 million towards accelerating the kind of research around heat pump technologies, as well as cold weather heat pumps that let us do that in other regions throughout the country. So it's a lot, and that also puts us in a place where we can kind of confront some of those other particular kind of adaptation concerns I mentioned earlier. How are we dealing with extreme heat in a way that is particularly responsive, but also not increasing energy burden for those that are using more electricity? So all of these pieces are happening in tandem. Where we have a really great opportunity for cultivate an environment of innovation, I think, is in how we bend towards climate response as being a unifying principle and not something in which you opt in or opt out of, depending on what part of the tech sector you're involved in. Every part of the tech sector needs to be supporting this species level effort, and needs to be doing that in a way that they can demonstrate and they can benefit from all of the environmental resources that are now coming out of these historic investments from Congress.
Thank you very much, Mark. As a native of Minnesota, extreme weather heat pumps are definitely something that interests me a lot. Commissioner Flynn?
I just have to say, I totally agree on the heat pump front. What a fantastic technology. And this is an area where I'm a firm believer. It's a question, I think, for local government to ask, how do we help incentivize that change, right? I can't force private property owners to take action. How do I help? Right. And again, this is me as a finance guy. There are mechanisms that we can use. Sometimes they are not, enabled in certain states. We see certain, legal frameworks that are established. PACE being one typically for solar. It's the property assessed clean energy programs that allow property owners to essentially borrow money to do energy upgrades that are assessed on their property tax over time rather than as a personal loan. That is something that's been going on out west for a very long time. We see it here in Pennsylvania, at the commercial level, but it hasn't transitioned to the residential. And that doesn't just conceptually apply to solar. That can apply to heat pumps. That can apply to energy efficiency. There are all kinds of ways that we can think about these things. That is actually the application of technology. To a certain extent, it's framing the concept and building the framework within which you can execute on these types of programs. Now it's funny. I've worked obviously on the finance side. I work on the local government side. I also started a technology company. So I've kind of played in all pieces of this. The technology is always with us, right? It is, when we, first created fire, we had technology. So technology is a part of humanity, how we use tools. I think what's changed in the last 30 years is that the personal computing, revolution has made us ask, how much more can I do, right? So it has revolutionized how we think, the level of quantification we can put at our fingertips, but it hasn't fundamentally changed us as humans, right? People will adopt, people will adapt. Don't think of what we are doing as fundamentally new. It's an iteration on how humanity changes and evolves over time. I think what's interesting when I think about the utilizing technology at the local government level, one of the biggest challenges is that, and I would say in general, right, not just local government, government is constrained in terms of capacity. Again, how do you think forward? Well, you have to resource time. Local government, especially smaller local governments, are generally speaking not resourced to plan out 30 years. If I want to move forward and say, let's think about utilizing the social cost of carbon as a shadow carbon pricing mechanism for our financing plans and our capital improvement plans, that's a lot of work for a finance director, for a public works director, for all these people who are trying to just keep the lights on, keep the streets swept, make sure that the core services of government are being delivered. So how do we resource, that additional capacity that's necessary to be thinking about these changes that take a lot of time? They don't just happen overnight. We can't just spend $1 and it's going to get fixed. We have to embed these things in change. And that takes these professionals that are on the ground, but they need to be resourced. So technology can really do some interesting things there, but it's a question of, the technology is already there. It's a question of how do we understand it and how do we integrate it into, the core operations of how government and other industry participants think about technology and its utilization to think and coordinate efforts going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cliff, I believe you said you could also talk to regulatory certainty sort of in this area as well.
Yeah, I'd like to tie together a couple of the themes that we've heard. Professor Wurgler talked about the importance of regulatory certainty, and that's absolutely true. And bringing in heat pumps as an example, heat pumps are a long-lived investment. It's a 30-year investment, and you need to have confidence as a building owner over the next 30 years that that's going to be the right investment for your building. You're going to get a good return on that investment. And so it's really critically important that policy sets the right signals, and then we'll have innovation take over. We'll have technology innovation and business practice innovation that will answer those signals. And having that long-term certainty is going to be critical, because we need to have $1 trillion investment in our grid, in our buildings, to decarbonize, to meet the challenge, the climate crisis. And so we need policies, and these policies could be adopted at the state, the federal, or the local levels. And one policy that we work on a lot are building performance standards, because we know, as Zosia said, we know that buildings account for 39% of energy-based greenhouse gas emissions. They're the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and we need to decarbonize them. But it's not enough to just decarbonize our new buildings, because our existing buildings, every year we only add 2% or so to our building stock. We need to reach all of the buildings. And so there are lots of great policies, and Commissioner Flynn mentioned things like PACE, but they aren't moving the needle fast enough to prevent catastrophic climate change. And we need something stronger, and that's what building performance standards are. They actually require that all existing buildings have to improve their performance. And we've developed a model that a number of cities are using around the country. Most recently, Boston just adopted a month or two ago their building performance standard, but we have them in New York and Washington, D.C., the states of Colorado and Washington State. And you set a long-term standard to say, all right, all of our buildings are going to need to be completely decarbonized by this date. And so people won't, when their furnace fails, they'll plan that they're going to put in a heat pump to replace that furnace. They won't just replace it with a somewhat better furnace that might be okay now, but it's not going to work in a long-term context. So sending those long-term signals to the market through policy, and then allowing entrepreneurs and inventors to innovate the solutions, things like what we hear from Nexii. Terrific that they've done that. Even, and I heard that the policy in Vancouver and British Columbia was important in driving demand for that product, but there's a huge problem with externalities being ignored. People are not paying the price for their pollution, and so they're not rewarded for the solutions that we need to get to carbon neutrality.
Thank you very much, Cliff. With that, I'm going to go into some individual questions that are really intended to sort of probe the specific expertise of each individual here on the panel. After each person's responded, other panelists, please feel free to jump in. A lot of these are they're aimed at one person, but I think all of you have expertise that'd be relevant to each one. Going off of just the size of our building stock and how infrequently the new buildings are built or buildings are rebuilt, I wanted to ask Mark. The federal government owns just over 300,000 buildings, including a few that I used to work in, including the world's largest office building. Where's the federal government, you think, been a leader in decarbonization? And also, where does it have room to learn from local governments and private businesses as it tries to decarbonize that enormous amount of building stock?
Great question. And also the reason that I am in the position that I'm in. The ability to kind of learn and take galvanizing momentum that's happening in small towns and cities all across the country, to be able to utilize that in cooperation with the federal government that has such a huge footprint, such a huge capacity to be able to have transformative impact in the built environment, is exactly the role that I've taken on. Cliff was mentioning building performance standards, which are particularly near and dear to my heart for having kind of worked like laboriously to get what we call Local Law 97 passed in New York City, which was the kind of globally the first building performance standards of a major city for large buildings. And what it does is sets that real clear, not only parameters of the fact that we're gonna set the cap and the limits of carbon that buildings can be responsible for, but there's going to be consequences if you don't pursue those. And that set a framework and around which many other cities have rallied and have developed their own standards that have improved upon it in many different ways and done different things. But the federal government also has an example, has an opportunity to lead by example, which I think is also something that a lot of cities that have been aggressively working on climate have been kind of looking and waiting for a real significant federal partner to do that. And we think that it's important to kind of like, show up and do that in a way that is demonstrably different. And so earlier this year, we also announced that the federal government will be pursuing building performance standards for its giant portfolio of buildings. And so we launched an interagency federal sustainability effort, not just by ourselves in terms of the White House, but with the GSA, General Service Administration, Department of Energy, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency, to develop the first ever building performance standards for the federal government. And the process is underway right now. As you mentioned, lots and lots of buildings, so lots of analysis and a lot of things that have to go into place to do this correctly. But these building performance standards will establish metrics and targets and tracking methods that will kind of help us reach those larger federal emissions goals, both the ones that are kind of nationally applicable, as well as the significant ones we put on the federal government operations and facilities. And the performance standards will also they'll identify like milestones over time so that we can continue to build this out and develop and make sure that we are doing things correctly, and that we're also being very transparent about like what the decision points are along that process. And that's part of how you lead by example. And it's also part of how you kind of demonstrate that this is critical path for building decarbonization. The majority of buildings that you're spending all of your time in, whether it's today or over the next 30 years, are going to be built already. And so you're going to be looking at every time you think about where you're waking up, getting coffee, going to like supermarket, a church, going to drop your kids off at school, whatever it is that you're doing, how you experience this transition to a clean energy and zero carbon economy, I believe it happens in buildings. And so we have an opportunity to kind of really have an experiential and test case for how to do that. And also we have an opportunity to kind of like grow and work with cities and showcase that the federal example is another way in which you can do that too. So I'm particularly excited about that, and also excited about what that means for partnership between local, state, and federal government.
Thank you very much, Mark. Does anyone have anything to add on that? That excellent answer.
I think it's just exciting to hear Mark talk about that. He was a real leader in helping that happen, making that happen in New York. And the fact that he's now at the White House in a position to make it happen nationally and in partnership with local governments around the country is hugely impactful. And just bottom line, we need to do everything all at once. We need to get every sector of the economy to decarbonize, but buildings are the single largest one. And there is a real opportunity, because as we decarbonize our grid, we're going to have to go to intermittent power sources, solar and wind. They're going to have to provide a huge portion of our power. And we can address intermittency through things like batteries, but it's enormously expensive. It's necessary. We're going to need to make huge investments in batteries, and the administration is really leading on that. But it's going to be very expensive, and it's much less expensive. We can save more than $1 trillion on the supply side, on the grid side, if we instead invest in our buildings. We'll get a much better return on investment from getting our buildings more efficient, so they're using less energy, less power, less gas, and so that they can stop using electricity at peak times and potentially even send electricity back to the grid at peak times. So there's a real opportunity here, and the challenge is going to be to fix our policies, our utility schedules, the kind of messages that our utilities get and that our building owners get. So that building owners will be communicating electronically with the utilities seamlessly. The utilities will warn them when there's a critical peak power event, and they'll be able to curtail their power. So that's a win-win. It's going to be a huge savings to ratepayers. We'll pay less money to build out that grid, and we'll be able to use some of those savings to reward building owners and communities that are part of the solution. So we're transforming buildings from sort of part of the problem that are using electricity and potentially part of blackouts to part of the solution, an asset to the grid that's protecting us from blackouts and adding to the resilience of our grid.
Thank you. Andrew, looks like you have something to add as well.
Oh, you know, this really is an interesting topic, and it's one that you know, obviously, yeah, in a built our community, we have a built environment, right? We are completely built out, and so the transition of existing, you know, buildings is really important. And again, I always go back to, you know, the municipal government has buildings, and I will tell you that I'm a firm believer that I am not qualified to tell you whether we should put solar on the roof or put in LED lights. What I need is a framework within which our professional staff can make those judgments. That guidance is really important to come from outside experts who are packaging information to set that stage so that again, 90,000 local governments can make the right decisions and understand the drivers. We know there's long-term savings, but I only have a finite set of resources right now to take action. So what's the best move that can be made with our finite resources right now in that move forward? How do I build capacity to take the next step and the next step and the next step? Sometimes that is, hey, there's federal grant money coming, and that's fantastic. But yeah, it's important to recognize that 75% of the infrastructure in the United States is financed by state and local government, right? It's not money coming from the federal government. Though that number is probably changing, yeah, with the most recent, passage of the bill. But as a historical average, the money is coming from state and local tax dollars that is financing change. But the federal government, by providing guidance on building standards and how to do improvements, and the nonprofit community doing the same thing, providing that guidance, building momentum, it helps not only the local professionals, but local elected officials, you know, have that cover to say, yeah, this is important and we can make this change, because we do have to have these conversations at the local level. And you need to be, you know, able to articulate a lot of complex changes, you know, to every citizen, because it's their tax dollars, right? It's a huge challenge. But you know, when you get the support of the federal government and the nonprofit community, local governments can definitely take action and move forward.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brown, looks like you might have something to add.
I do, yeah. I want to thank Mark and Cliff and the rest of the speakers on the panel for all their work around building performance standards over the last decade. And I wanted to come back to just thinking about the next frontiers of building kind of climate policy. What we're seeing and keeping a close eye on at Nexii is embodied carbon policy. And that, you know, for folks who aren't in the building sector, right, operational carbon is the carbon emitted from how we heat, cool, light our buildings every year. Embodied carbon is the carbon that's tied up in the building materials. So that's emitted when we extract materials, manufacture materials, transport them to site, assemble the buildings, and then there's a critical component at the building end of life as well. And so we're focused on both operational and embodied carbon, and really seeing that kind of new kind of buy clean agendas coming out in various states across the US, California, Colorado, New York, Washington, and more, and federally in Canada as well. We're looking at buy clean agendas, which basically is purchasing discounts proposed for lower carbon materials and tax incentives offered to developers using carbon smart products. And so we're seeing some great momentum, and I think it's going to be a big area going forward. And that's because, you know, as we continue to decarbonize our grid, and as our buildings become more energy efficient, thanks to these building performance standards, that embodied carbon piece is going to take up a much bigger fraction of the building footprint. So Architecture 2030 estimates 50% of overall carbon footprint from buildings will come from embodied carbon between now and 2050. that the COP, at COP, there was a great kind of first movers coalition came together and committed, 34 companies committed to buying low or no emission products in the built environment, including Amazon, Apple, Boeing, and others. So that's a great way to kind of pull emerging technologies into the marketplace and overcome some of those barriers that I touched on earlier. And thinking holistically about embodied carbon as well, there's been a comment in the chat here about the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one that's not expended, or the most sustainable building is the one that's not built. 100% of our buildings on the planet today are existing buildings, and we really need solutions to reuse, repurpose, and deep energy retrofits of that existing building stock, which is a key part of the embodied carbon discussion as well. So I just wanted to chime in with that perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Brown. Actually, that kind of leads into the question that I had for you. You talked a little bit about how the building construction sector is addressing that carbon reduction, both operational and embodied, but I was wondering what this sort of means for the materials and the actual buildings that are being built, specifically on the manufacturer of building materials side of things.
Yeah, thanks. So Carbon Leadership Forum at UW in Washington is a great leader in this space, really looking at carbon sequestering materials and Nexii ourselves, we're looking at integration of our product with things like mass timber structures and cores. And thinking about, lots of ways. Well, the primary way to measure embodied carbon is life cycle assessment. And environmental product declarations are sort of the nutrition labels for building products that's emerging as a standard. So, we're measuring the embodied carbon of every one of our panels, but also working with clients and our project partners to look at that whole building embodied carbon, and what does that mean when we pair Nexii envelopes with various structures. So, I think there's a lot of innovation happening in steel, in the concrete industry, and targets such as 20–30% below conventional material emissions baselines that are being chased. And actually, the World Green Building Council just came out with a revision on their net zero carbon building commitment, which for the first time, and that was announced at COP, and for the first time that includes embodied carbon as well, with a target of 40% reduction in embodied carbon in the building itself. So I think a lot of progress, and it is going to drive innovation in the manufacturing sector, both in the raw materials, but as well as in the products themselves. So we're keen to be tracking that and chasing some ambitious targets ourselves.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question for Professor Wurgler. So I understand that you recently completed a survey of practitioners, policymakers, and academics. Can you take us through what you found going through that survey?
Yeah, thank you. So we thought it would be useful for a finance audience to sort of coordinate on where we are at with respect to attitudes and beliefs, and what we should do next. So we conducted a survey. First, we sent 11,000 emails, not one at a time, but in some sort of batch method. And 861 people were actually kind enough to respond. And that included, hundreds of academics, policymakers, and finance practitioners. People of all, all locations around the world. They got their highest degree 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, a couple years ago, people who work in climate related areas, people who didn't. And what we found was quite interesting. The first thing we found is that attitudes with respect to the questions that we asked were very uniform. There wasn't a lot of disagreement on the sort of first order topics that we surveyed people about. So that gave us some confidence that we were able to make some kind of decent generalizations. So, for example, the first question we asked was, can you help us identify the short and the long-term risks that you believe climate change presents. And this is, of course, necessarily at a pretty high level. And it didn't really matter how what kind of respondent category you were. There was broad agreement that regulatory risk was the number one sort of risk to investors and businesses over the next 5 years. So that gets back at our earlier discussion on this panel about policy uncertainty. There was also broad agreement that over the next 30 years, physical climate risk to buildings and our environment, how it impacts us physically, that was the greatest threat. So I thought that was interesting as well, that we sort of foresee this tidal wave coming, but it's still a little bit on the horizon. I think another one of our really interesting findings was regarded how do you think financial markets are currently pricing these climate risks? And there we found by about a 20-to-1 margin that financial markets, whether it's sort of stock market or insurance market, real estate, by a 20-to-1 margin, respondents felt that the markets are underappreciating the climate risks as opposed to, overemphasizing them. So there's a great deal of uniformity toward, the finance community still isn't fully respecting these risks. I guess we asked participants about what do you think the biggest force for improvement or change is likely to be. There, I think, we got the answer that we expected to get from this audience, which is that carbon taxes is just an inevitable part of the solution. It's not going to be entirely voluntary on the part of businesses suddenly, turning around 180 degrees and saying, yeah, actually, we're going to change our business model overnight. No, there needs to be some sort of institution to organize and incentivize them. Institutional investors were regarded as an important force, especially by the private sector. So those best able to judge that pressure. So those are some of the findings that we got out of the survey. If nothing else, then we raised awareness to 11,000 people who got this. 10,000 of them apparently didn't want this email about the issue and the research focus that we're pursuing. But I think we put a lot of people on a similar page as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cliff, we have a question for you. Actually, just came in from the audience. What are some of the key policy levers that would improve outcomes for disadvantaged communities, especially around sustainability?
Well, Mark talked about the Justice 40 that the White House is leading on, which I think is huge, a commitment to spend 40% of all investments towards clean energy, towards decarbonization, towards electric vehicles, the whole 9 yards, to benefit these disinvested communities, these frontline communities that have been hit hardest. I think you have to follow the money, understand why things are happening the way they are. I work in the building sector. I see what happens here. Often you have governments putting out RFPs, requests for proposals for someone to do work. And without thinking about it, they include things that create impediments to small businesses, especially small businesses from communities of color participating. Bonding requirements, insurance requirements, capitalization requirements that effectively disqualify a whole host of companies from participating and putting out huge. If you're putting out $1 billion contract, there's no way a small business can have a chance at bidding on that. So there are lots of best practices around contracting, around workforce development, to make sure that there are a huge number of jobs at all skill levels. Everything from roofers and electricians to architects and engineers are going to be needed for this $1 trillion investment in our building sector. And those jobs, unfortunately, have traditionally gone to people who came from affluent backgrounds. And we need to have the workforce training available and deal with structural racism everywhere from companies to unions to everywhere else, to open up pathways to people in these communities to be able to fully participate in the gains from these massive investments. So those are some of the things. The other thing is just most basically, nothing about them without them. Whenever we're setting any kind of policy, everybody who's affected, especially those who have not historically had a voice in policymaking, need to be at the table. And we're not listening enough to these communities, and they need to be empowered. And we need to recognize that you have people working 2 and 3 jobs. They don't have a lot of free time to participate in task forces and that sort of thing. So there need to be compensated opportunities, both for individuals and for the community-based organizations that represent them, to have a real voice in policy making. And the good news, though, is that there are huge opportunities. We can save so much money from improving our building performance, from not averting some of these grid-side investments we have to do. There's enough of a pie that everybody can benefit. And the key is just to make sure that the benefits don't all flow to the same people who have always gotten the benefits.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Flynn, so you mentioned earlier, talked a few times here, there's 90,000 subnational governments in the United States. So Mount Lebanon has clearly made some major strides towards improving its sustainability over recent years. How have you been able to share those practices with the other 89,999 or so subnational governments across the country?
It's a great question, and it's one that I am proud to say that local government, as a general rule, is very collaborative. I'm actually, I want to give a shout out to a regional group here that's actually housed at at Pitt. It's called Connect. It's the Congress of Neighboring Communities. It brings together the city of Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, and the ring communities around the city of Pittsburgh to collaborate on common policy challenges. That is one example of many local government groups that occur across the country, whether it's the GFOA looking at finance, whether there are other types of groups. Again, there's always a lot of collaboration at the local government level. People are looking for best practices. So there's lots of opportunities to share. So the question really becomes, how do you build a best practice? How do you leverage the position you are in to move something forward and then share it in the broader community? That's really one of the interesting opportunities and challenges in local government is, yes, there are lots of us, but we all can innovate and we can all bring new ideas to the table, whether it's financing mechanisms or thinking about how do we implement complete streets? What does that mean? How do we think about public rights of way? An example that we're actively talking about is, how do you fund and maintain your urban tree canopy, right? We all know that trees are very valuable, right? And there are lots of important issues around equity when it comes to the urban heat sink. But we don't necessarily talk about, well, how much does it actually cost to maintain trees? I always tell people, if you think about it, when you spend $300 to plant a tree, you're thinking about 30 years from now when you have a beautiful tree in front of your house. You're not thinking about 50 years when you're going to spend $10,000 to dig it out, right? These are investments that communities need to be making and thinking about. How do we make those investments? And there is a lot of innovation, and people are sharing those things, and it's happening. You just don't see it all the time. But that's where, again, I'm a firm believer that our form of government is really important because it allows for innovation, and we need to make sure that not only the federal government but state governments are allowing that innovation to occur, rather than trying to force things, because great ideas come from small places. So how do we foster that and support it?
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting point, and great to hear that Pitt is kind of bringing all those local communities together, and getting some good ideas of how to improve our specific region. I'd like to have, as we're sort of coming up on time here, I'd like to have just one more question for the entire panel. We're at a business school. I'm a business school student talking to other business school students, see a few of my classmates here in the attendees list who are also looking at going into jobs and renewable energy and sustainability in general. So it's natural to ask you, what are the perspectives and bases of knowledge that future leaders coming out of business schools, coming out of undergrad programs, coming out of other graduate programs are going to need in the future to really drive sustainability forward in private sector? Let's I guess start with Cliff. I think he was ready to answer that right away.
Well, one thing I would say is, and I get a lot of people coming to me for career advice, and often people want to kind of work for a nonprofit like mine, or they want to work for a pure play green company like Zosia's Nexii, and that's great, and we do a lot of good. But I would not undersell how much good you can do in big mainstream corporations that are not especially green. It can be more frustrating. You may not be surrounded by people that care as much about sustainability or climate change as you do, but you can do enormous good from the inside. And even if you don't choose to stay there very long, you can develop the ability to articulate a business case. Ultimately, people are going to have to make big money from investing and doing the right thing. And you're going to need to be able to speak their language and explain how they can make money and understand where they're coming from and what prejudices they have. And in this case, I'm talking about really inertia. I mean, the biggest thing is people will always say, well, I've made money this way. My career has prospered doing it this way. Why should I do anything differently? And so you really need to understand the nature of the business to be able to make the business case in their language, understanding their frame. So by all means, if you get a great job at a solar company or a nonprofit, go for it. But don't look askance at the opportunity to make a huge difference inside a Fortune 100 company, where you really can make a difference from the inside, building the case. And then you can talk to those innovators outside the company and channel the right information to within your company.
Thank you very much. It's really insightful. Dr. Brown, do you have anything to add?
I thought that was a great point, Cliff. Thanks for sharing that. I would just sort of share the perspective that graduates that are coming out of school now in the next few years are going to have so many opportunities to work in sustainability and sustainability related fields. Like every job is going to have a sustainability or climate component, whether that's working on mitigation, reducing emissions, carbon removal, or on the adaptation side of things. We've just had devastating floods here in BC. And that's exposed some infrastructure weaknesses. So working to strengthen our infrastructure, or all the other industries that are pivoting now to enable a green economic transition, legal, financial, public sectors we've talked about a lot today. And we do need all hands on deck for this challenge of a lifetime. So I think there's a lot of opportunity across all sectors, and I really like just thinking about what should I focus on as an individual coming out of school? I'd like this climate action Venn diagram that comes from Ayanna Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson, who authored the book All We Can Save. And they talk about what is the problem that needs solving, one. Two is what are my skills? What am I good at? And then three is what gives me joy and what gives me purpose. And that last one is, the intersection of those is ideally where if you're fortunate enough to find a job that ticks those three right in the middle, that's fantastic. But that the joy part of it is key, because, without that, that's what leads to burnout. And it's really important, and specifically in the kind of climate sustainability world, to have a connection to the vision of, the low carbon future we're all striving for.
Thank you very much. I'll have to find that. That looks like a very useful Venn diagram for me, especially as I'm trying to figure out what I want to do here in the next few months. Commissioner Flynn, if you give your advice as well.
You're recognizing this is a business school, but I say this, having been a banker myself, having worked in finance, having worked in technology, and obviously working with local governments, I will tell you that personally, I think the most important things that we always need to remember is that history and civics are really important, right? Why are we here? Helps us to figure out where we're going. And so having a foundation in history is really important to understand kind of what the journey is that we're on. And civics, this is, again, just one of my personal preferences, is that in a democracy, we have to engage and we have to understand how to engage. It is really, really important in whatever industry you're in how you engage with government is going to have an impact on your success. And understanding how to engage. And that's not just from a business perspective, but that's just as an individual, right? How do you engage as a resident? How do you understand the processes that we as a national community have created to understand our shared assets and our shared journey, and to determine what's next? That's really important, and we tend to just take it for granted. So even if you're on that journey to go down kind of the high finance or green building journey, how you engage and understanding where we are in the journey are both really important things. So don't forget about them as you are on that path forward. I think it really just is important to kind of keep that in context. Because we think about, well, and I just want to give one example. We think about our food system, and we talk about the challenges of our food system and where we are today, right? We think about food deserts. We think about the concentration of sugars, how the obesity epidemic that's been created, right? There are lots of problems in our food system. But if we step back 70 or 80 years, and we told people that were alive back then, hey, what if we had a food system that gave enough calories to every person? They would be absolutely blown away. And they would be so impressed that we as a society had accomplished that. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Know that we need to move and improve and innovate and always move forward, but understanding that historical context of where we've been and what we have accomplished, really helps you articulate how you move forward. So just keep those two things in mind as you're considering your career steps.
Thank you very much. So I'm getting a message in here that we were actually out of time. So Mark and Jeff, I'm sorry, President Wurgler, I'm sorry we're not quite gonna be able to get to you. I just want to
I'll just say one last thing.
Yeah, sorry, Mark. Yeah, please. You have to jump in. Yeah.
That like business graduates should also consider careers in public service. It gives incredible perspective and allows for you to understand the role that business and government can play together in solving this generational crisis.
Yep. Thank you very much. So panelists, thank you very much for attending. I think we all learned a lot from each and every one of you. It's very insightful discussion, great answers to all of our questions. Attendees, thank you very much as well. This will be recorded, so if you want to share this with some of your friends who were busy or doing something else on this fine Friday afternoon here in Pittsburgh, you'll be able to send that out as well. So that is it, I think, on our panel side. Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for coming.